Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one there is additional Russian advances within the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. The Russians continue their offensive operations from the northernmost outskirts of the Donetsk region through the areas near Toretsk, Pokrovsk, and the area in between the two cities. The Russians also managed to advance southwest of Pokrovsk, gaining control over forest lines west of Bahatyr and the town of Bahatyr, advancing along the main highway. Starting out in the southern parts of the Donetsk region, the Russians managed to gain control over the remaining parts of Bahatyr. As we see with this geolocated footage, the Russians have raised the flag in the northern and western outskirts of the town, which indicates full control over it by the Russian forces. At the same time, the Russians also advanced along the highway west of Bahatyr in the direction of Odradne, where the Russians are now aligning the front line with the town of Odradne from the east and from the south. The Russians will look to attack the town itself from the eastern direction along the main highway and from the southern direction along the road and forest lines. Gaining full control over Bahatyr will allow the Russians to start offensive operations towards Oleksivka from across the Bahatyr river line in a western direction towards Odradne and onwards towards Komar as well. The Ukrainians do not have a high concentration of settlements in the area between Bahatyr and Komar, with only Odradne as a singular town in between the two towns. The Russians will look to gain control over Odradne, which will allow them to gain control over the forest line areas here to the north of the highway, clearing the highway all the way towards Komar, and at the same time will also cut off the southern connection to the towns along Oleksivka to Dashne along the main highway to the north, which means that the Russians attacking from the northern flank will allow them to operationally encircle the Ukrainian forces, and a push in a western direction can physically encircle them. It is unlikely that the Russians will develop any significant offensive operations towards Komar or beyond that of Odradne within the coming days, as the Russians will instead focus on expanding their foothold within Oleksivka, advance through the town and flank the town as well as the others along the river line over the next couple of days to the next few weeks to gain full control over the northern flank. That, combined with the capture of Odradne, will allow the Russians to have a clear front line along the east of the settlements of the Ukrainians along the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, from which the Russians can launch offensive operations towards Komar, towards the settlements along the border area between the Dnipropetrovsk and Donetsk regions, as well as advancing along the town of Vesele towards Fedorivka and flanking the fortified positions to the southwest. The Russians will look to expand their control over the Mokrieli river line, where they will create multiple crossings across it for flanking maneuvers beyond that of the fortified positions, or a similar case to the north of the Vovcha river line. Further north to the east of Pokrovsk, the Russians made several advances north of Melanfka following the capture of the town. The Russians reached the water treatment plants here to the north of Melanfka and gained control of the eastern parts of Novopoltavka. According to some reports, the Russians gained full control over the town. However, the geolocated footage so far does not corroborate that report. Therefore, I'm leaving the western parts remaining under Ukrainian control. The Russians attacking the water treatment plant and the fortified position along the main road here north of Melanfka, as well as the capture of the fortified position southwest of Novopoltavka, thus opened the road for the Russian forces to enter the town. Gaining control over Novopoltavka and the fortified positions within the near vicinity creates a large buffer zone between the highway intersection and to the north along the Ukrainian positions, which will allow the Russians to launch further offensive operations here west of Melanfka and to the north in the direction of Novolenivka, where the Russians will be able to expand their zone of control around the highway and not be under direct fire control of Ukrainian forces, allowing them to expand their zone of control to flank the fortified positions of the Ukrainians near Yelisavetivka and south of Melanfka, gain control over Mirne, start fighting over Mykolaivka and Novoekonomishne. The Russians will look to gain control over both of these settlements with the objective of gaining control over the Kazan-Terets river and a strong eastern flank into Mirnorod, allowing the Russians to have a strong presence on the eastern flank of Pokrovsk, which will also allow the Russians to develop offensive operations in northern direction along the fortified positions, or further northeast towards the settlements of Shevchenko-Perche, Kupcheve, and the ones along the fortified positions, not directly attacking them. In either case, fighting over these settlements will allow the Russians to have a stronger western flank, as they continue offensive operations in the northern direction to have a stronger northern flank as well. Both of these add up to further offensive operations by the Russians along the main highway, both in the western direction but also in the eastern direction towards Jablonivka, the flank of the fortified positions near the town, as well as a wider buffer zone on the northern flank of the highway to operationally encircle Kashyanivka, secure the highway for their own transport and logistics, and offensive operations in the west as well. This will also allow the Russians to develop offensive operations in the eastern direction, where the Russians have stormed Staромykolivka directly and gained a foothold in the southern parts of the town, getting control over approximately 20% of it. The Russians will look to gain full control of it, as well as Nativka, where the Ukrainians are trying to hold their positions, but their supply lines are under direct threat by Russian flanking maneuvers towards the town of Suria in the rear. This forces the Ukrainians to make a difficult choice of potentially withdrawing from their forward positions or risk encirclement, to which the Russians will have fire control over the withdrawal routes. The Ukrainians would be pressed and under direct fire by the Russian forces, and if they do not withdraw, then they risk complete encirclement. And that is the advantages that Russians have gained with the control over the fortified positions here west of Suria. The Russians will continue offensive operations to gain control over the remaining towns here in the pocket that is created near Suria and Romanivka. This will allow them to develop offensive operations further along the highway and towards Toretsk on the flank from the south, while the Russians also continue offensive operations in the northern flank, where they managed to gain a foothold within Delivka and gain control over approximately 30% of the town. The Russians are fighting on the western and eastern flanks of the town, fighting over the fortified positions and forest lines in the area, where the main advance is along the railway, where the Russians will look to expand on the flanks of Delivka once they capture the town, to flank the fortified positions of the Ukrainians from their weak points, and to connect their forces with the forest patch to the south, as well as the fortified positions to the north, getting control over a wide flank on the northern flank of Toretsk. This will also allow them to concentrate their forces in the western and southern directions, where the capture of the towns to the southwest of Toretsk will allow the Russians to secure the western flank and allow for a pincer maneuver from the western and eastern directions. All of this adds up to the Russians improving their positions around the city of Toretsk and to the south of Kashyanivka for the future operations to operationally encircle the city itself by cutting off all roads, except for one road, which you'll have fire control over with FPV drones and artillery. The Russians also continue their advances along the canal, where they're expanding their bridgehead across through Oserianivka. The Russians are here looking to gain full control over the canal area and the fortified positions in the area, for further pushes towards the second Delivka to the northeast of the first Delivka near Toretsk. The Russians will look to advance along the forest lines and forest patches in the area. However, this area is heavily fortified, which means that the appropriate direction for the Russians to push through would be along the railway as the main push, considering it has the high ground with forest lines to the east and to the west, covering both flanks. This allowed them to reach the rear of the fortified positions and then combine that with assaults from that direction. With an additional crossing here near the northwest of Andrivka, the Russians can flank from the northern flank as well. The Russians will continue offensive operations directly head on, simply to keep the Ukrainian forces there and also to attack them during any withdrawal. While they attempt to encircle their forces in the area, the Ukrainians do not have any significant positions that are heavily reinforced and allow them to withstand heavy artillery fire. This means that the Russians will likely bombard this area heavily with artillery, MLRS, FPV drones, and everything that they have to inflict as much casualties as possible on the Ukrainian forces, as they look to gain full control over the area around Chasiv Yar, all the way down south towards Ivanopilya and the northern flank of Toretsk. Further north in the Luhansk region, the Russians managed to make a small advance Here south of Rekivka, the Russians both advanced north of the forest patch area near Novomikhailivka and also gained control over a forest patch along the river line connected to Rekivka. The Russians are here looking to gain control over the forest lines and forest patches south of Rekivka as well as along the main road towards Makiivka to the east. All of this is to open up multiple roads towards Rekivka, spreading up their forces, not be as easy pickings for Ukrainian FPV drones to gain control over Rekivka and the remaining parts of the Luhansk region for further offensive operations towards the main road here north of Nove and the fortified positions in the near vicinity. Gaining control over Rekivka would mean that all settlements within the Luhansk region, except of Svetly-Rubova, will be under Russian control. Finally, as the Russians continue developing their technologies with FPV drones, they have now developed ones that fly up to 40 kilometers away from the front line. Based on this, we see that the Ukrainians have started reporting that the Russians are striking the highway between Dobropilya here to the southwest and Kramatorsk in the northeast. This highway here is being struck by Russian drones, not just the Lancet drones, but also FPV drones, where the drone operators closest proximity to this highway is approximately 30 kilometers away at the front line near Novodenivka. The Russian FPV drone operators are mostly not located at the front line exactly, but further behind Westishenka, Novolexandrivka, the general area further back to stay clear of Ukrainian direct fire. This allows them to strike this highway area from approximately 40 kilometers away. This shows that the Ukrainian logistics in the area, not just from Kramatorsk to Dobrobilya, but from the entire area within this pocket, is under threat by Russian drones. The Russians will be striking anything connecting from Kostiantynivka, Truskivka, and Kramatorsk to the front line from Pokrovsk in the west to Kostiantynivka and Toretsk in the east. This will all be under direct threat by Russian artillery, FPV drones, and anything else they have available to strike behind Ukrainian lines. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.